Welcome to my channel, friends. I would be very happy if you subscribe to the channel and like it before you sleep. Have a nice listening time. I still remember the night when my life changed forever. It was the summer of 2019, and I had just finished my first year of university. I had planned a road trip with two of my closest friends, Mark and Sarah, to explore some of the forgotten towns in the remote corners of the country. We were adventurous, seeking hidden history and mystery in places that time had abandoned. Little did we know, this trip would uncover horrors that none of us could have ever imagined. The road had been long and winding, with stretches of land so barren that it felt like we were driving through a void. Mark was behind the wheel, Sarah in the passenger seat, and I sat in the back, staring out into the endless fields of overgrown grass. We had been on the road for hours when we finally stumbled upon a town that wasn't marked on any map. The town's sign read "Welcome to Black Hollow," but the paint had peeled so badly that it was almost illegible. The houses were old, with crumbling facades, broken windows, and overgrown gardens. There was a strange atmosphere about the place, like it had been forgotten not just by people, but by time itself. Mark slowed the car down as we drove through the empty streets. No lights, no movement, just silence. "This is creepy," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. "Maybe we should stop for the night," I suggested, feeling an odd chill crawl up my spine. We found what looked like an old inn. The building was in disrepair, but it still stood. Mark parked the car, and we all hesitated before getting out. As we approached the door, I noticed something off about the air. It was thick, almost oppressive, like the town was watching us. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit lobby. Behind the counter stood an old man, hunched over, with a thin frame and skin that seemed too tight for his bones. His eyes, though tired, glowed with an eerie intensity. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice gravelly and dry. Mark, ever the skeptic, smirked. "We're just looking for a place to stay for the night." The old man stared at him for a long moment before shaking his head. "There's no safety here. This town, it doesn't let people leave." Sarah laughed nervously. "What do you mean?" The innkeeper's eyes narrowed. "Black Hollow is cursed. Once you enter, you belong to it. If you stay too long, it will claim you, just like it did to the others." We exchanged uneasy glances. Mark, trying to keep the mood light, said, "Come on, man. It's just an old town. We'll be fine." He tossed some cash on the counter and took a key from the hook. "Thanks for the room." The old man didn't respond. He just watched us with those hollow eyes as we made our way upstairs. The room was small, with faded wallpaper and a single flickering light bulb. The bed creaked under our weight as we sat down, trying to shake off the weird vibe the innkeeper had given us. "I don't like this place," Sarah said, hugging her knees to her chest. "Relax," Mark replied. "It's just an old man trying to scare us. We'll leave first thing in the morning." As the night wore on, we tried to sleep, but there was an unsettling quietness outside. No wind, no animals, just silence. That's when the whispers started. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then I saw Sarah sit up, her face pale. "Do you hear that?" she asked, her voice trembling. The whispers were faint, like they were coming from the walls, but I couldn't make out any words. They were soft, almost hypnotic, but with an undercurrent of malice. Mark was already up, pacing around the room, clearly unnerved. "It's probably just the wind or something. These old buildings creak. But deep down, we all knew it wasn't just the wind. There was something wrong with this town, something dark and ancient. Around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. They were slow and deliberate, echoing through the thin walls of the inn. I thought it might be the old man, but when I looked out the window, I saw shadows moving in the streets below. At first, I thought they were just tricks of the light, but the longer I stared, the more I realized that they weren't just shadows, they were figures. Dark, indistinct shapes, moving with an unnatural fluidity. They drifted through the streets, growing closer to the inn with each passing second. I woke Mark and Sarah, pointing out the window. Do you see that? Their faces went white as they stared at the shifting figures. What the hell are those? Sarah whispered. Before anyone could answer, the door to our room creaked open. We all froze, staring at the door as it slowly swung inward. But there was no one there, just an empty hallway. Mark grabbed a flashlight and stepped into the corridor, his hand shaking slightly. "Stay here," he muttered. Seconds felt like hours as we waited for him to return. The whispers grew louder, filling the room with their sinister hum. Then, from the hallway, we heard Mark scream. I rushed into the hallway to find Mark lying on the floor, his eyes wide with terror. It's inside the walls," he gasped, clutching his chest. I grabbed him, pulling him to his feet, and we all ran down the stairs. The old innkeeper was gone, and the front door was wide open. We didn't waste any time. We sprinted to the car, the shadows now moving faster, closing in around us. But when Mark turned the key, the car wouldn't start. "Come on," he shouted, slamming the steering wheel. The whispers were deafening now, filling our heads with unintelligible murmurs. The figures were right outside the car, pressing their dark, faceless forms against the windows. Chapter 6, The Final Revelation. Just when I thought we were done for, the old man appeared, standing in the middle of the street. He raised his hand, and the shadows stopped. For a moment, there was silence. "You can't leave," he said softly, his voice carrying through the night. "The town has already claimed you." "Why?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why us?" The old man's eyes were filled with sadness. "Because it needs souls to survive. It's been feeding on travelers for centuries. And now, it's your turn." Before we could react, the shadows surged forward, enveloping the car. The last thing I remember was the cold darkness wrapping around me, pulling me into the abyss. To this day, I don't know how I escaped. When I woke up, I was lying on the side of a highway, miles from Black Hollow. Mark and Sarah were gone, and no one could find any trace of the town. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the whispers. Second story. It all started with a dare. That's how most bad ideas start, right? It was the fall of 2020, and I was back in my hometown for the first time in years. I had grown up in a small, sleepy town with little to do, but the one thing that had always intrigued me as a kid was the old, abandoned mental asylum just on the outskirts. It had been shut down in the 1980s after rumors of patient abuse, strange disappearances, and the tragic fire that killed dozens of patients and staff. No one talked about it anymore. It was the kind of place that became a ghost in the collective memory of the town. People drove by it, but no one dared to go inside. Except us. Chapter 1, The Bet. It was a Friday night, and I was out with some old friends, Jake, Liz, and Mike. We were sitting around a bonfire, reminiscing about the good old days when the topic of the asylum came up. Jake, ever the thrill seeker, proposed the idea. "I dare you to go inside the old asylum," he said, a mischievous grin spreading across his face. "Come on, man." "That place is dangerous," Liz protested. "It's condemned for a reason." Mike, who had always been the most skeptical of us, scoffed. "It's just an old building. There's nothing there." Before I knew it, the bet was made. We would go into the asylum, explore it, and if any of us chickened out, they'd owe the others dinner for a month. It sounded harmless enough at the time, but looking back, I wish we'd never gone. Chapter 2, The Asylum's Gaze. We arrived at the asylum just after midnight. The building loomed in the distance, its silhouette sharp against the pale light of the moon. It looked like a beast from a nightmare, with its crumbling walls, broken windows, and thick vines creeping up the sides. The air felt colder here, unnaturally so. The main gate was rusted but unlocked. As we stepped through, the creak of the iron sent a shiver down my spine. The front door of the asylum was wide open, as if waiting for us. I hesitated for a moment, but Jake marched forward, flashlight in hand. "Let's get this over with," he said, his voice echoing off the walls. We entered the lobby, where the smell of damp and decay hit us like a wave. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, rotting books, and the remnants of a world long gone. "This place is creepy as hell," Liz whispered, sticking close to me. Mike wandered off toward an old nurse's station, running his fingers over the dust-covered desk. "I wonder how many people lost their minds in here." "Enough to make it haunted," Jake said with a grin, but his voice was strained. Despite his bravado, even he seemed uneasy. Chapter 3, The First Signs. As we moved deeper into the building, the air grew heavier, almost suffocating. The long, narrow hallways stretched out before us, lined with old patient rooms. Most of the doors were closed, but a few stood slightly ajar, revealing empty beds and shattered windows. "Let's split up," Jake suggested, clearly trying to keep things exciting. "We can cover more ground that way." I wasn't thrilled with the idea, but before I could protest, Jake and Mike were already heading down one corridor, leaving Liz and me to explore the other. We walked in silence for a while, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. Every now and then, I thought I saw something move in the shadows, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. "Do you feel that?" Liz asked, her voice barely a whisper. I nodded. The air was different now, colder, and there was a strange static-like sensation prickling my skin. It felt like we were being watched. We stopped in front of a door marked Room 106. Unlike the others, this door was slightly ajar, and inside, there was an old hospital bed with restraints still attached to the frame. Liz stepped forward, her curiosity getting the better of her. This must have been a high-security room. As she spoke, a loud bang echoed down the hallway behind us. We spun around, shining our flashlights in the direction of the noise, but saw nothing. Just the endless stretch of darkness. "We should go find the others," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. But as we turned to leave, the door to room 106 slammed shut on its own. Chapter 4, The Ghost in the Ward. Liz screamed, and I grabbed the handle, yanking it open. There was nothing behind the door, just the same empty room. But something was wrong. The air felt colder, and the static sensation had intensified. It was then that I noticed something, scratches on the walls, deep grooves etched into the paint, as if someone, or something, had clawed at the surface in desperation. "We need to get out of here," Liz said, her voice shaking. I couldn't have agreed more. We hurried back through the corridors, calling out for Jake and Mike, but there was no response. The building seemed larger now, the hallways twisting and turning in ways they hadn't before. It felt like we were trapped in a maze. That's when we heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere deep within the asylum. What the hell was that? Liz whispered, her grip tightening on my arm. I didn't answer. Instead, I pulled her forward, desperate to find the others and get out. But the further we went, the stranger things became. The walls seemed to shift, and the doors that had been closed were now open. Shadowy figures flickered in the corner of my vision, but whenever I turned to look, they were gone. Then, finally, we found Jake standing in the middle of the hallway, his back to us. "Jake?" I called out, relieved. He didn't respond. As we got closer, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Jake's hands were at his sides, but his fingers were twitching, moving unnaturally fast, like they were being controlled by something else. "Jake?" Liz's voice was trembling. Suddenly, he turned around, and what we saw made us both scream. His eyes were completely white, his face twisted into a grotesque smile. His mouth opened, and in a voice that wasn't his own, he said, "You shouldn't have come here." We ran. Liz and I bolted down the hallway, our footsteps echoing off the walls. Behind us, we could hear Jake, or whatever had become of him, laughing, a high-pitched, inhuman sound. We didn't stop until we reached the exit, but when we burst through the door, we found ourselves not outside, but back in the asylum lobby. It was as if the building had shifted, trapping us inside. Liz was sobbing now, panic taking over. "We're never going to get out." I grabbed her by the shoulders, trying to keep her calm. "We have to stick together. We'll find Mike, and we'll get out of here." But deep down, I wasn't sure I believed it. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw them, the patients. Their pale, lifeless faces stared at us from the shadows, their eyes empty, their mouths twisted into silent screams. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. The lights went out completely, and we were plunged into darkness. I don't remember much after that. Everything became a blur of fear and confusion. Somehow, we found Mike, but he wasn't the same. Like Jake, he had changed. His eyes were vacant, his movements slow and deliberate, as if he were a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. We ran again, but no matter how far we went, the asylum wouldn't let us leave. It was alive, a breathing entity that fed on fear and madness. And we were its next meal. In the end, it was only Liz and I who made it out, if you can even call it that. When the police found us, we were wandering along the side of the road, miles from the asylum, dazed and confused. They never found Jake or Mike. The asylum was torn down a few months later, but I know the truth. It's still there, waiting, lurking in the shadows, and it's hungry. Third story. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, just me and my wife, Laura. We had been working non-stop for months and desperately needed some time away from the city. So, when we found a listing for a secluded cabin deep in the forest, it seemed perfect. Far from civilization, no cell service, no internet, just peace, quiet, and nature. The cabin was old, rustic, and exactly what we were looking for. We arrived late Friday afternoon, the sun casting long shadows through the towering trees that surrounded the area. There was no one around for miles, just us. But as the evening wore on, something felt off. That first night, everything seemed fine. We cooked dinner, laughed, and enjoyed each other's company. The crackling fire in the stone hearth was comforting, and the warmth of the cabin felt like a cozy embrace. After a long week, it was exactly what we needed. Around midnight, Laura headed to bed, and I stayed up a little longer, enjoying the silence. The kind of silence you only find in the deepest parts of the wilderness. It was serene, almost too quiet. That's when I noticed it, the feeling that someone was watching me. I looked up from my book, glancing around the dimly lit room. There was no one there, just the flickering shadows cast by the fire. I shook my head, blaming it on my imagination, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come easy. The cabin creaked and groaned as old buildings do, but this was different. It was rhythmic, almost like footsteps outside. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but everything went quiet again. Laura slept soundly beside me, oblivious. Eventually, I drifted off, but my dreams were filled with shadows and whispers. The next morning, we went for a hike. The fresh air and beauty of the forest made me forget about the strange feeling from the night before. We wandered for hours, exploring trails that twisted through the dense woods. It was perfect, exactly what we'd hoped for. But when we got back to the cabin, something was wrong. There, on the front porch, were long scratches in the wood, deep, jagged marks that hadn't been there when we left. They looked like claw marks, but far too large for any animal in the area. Do you think a bear did this? Laura asked, her brow furrowed in concern. I shook my head. There are no bears around here, and even if there were, why would one scratch at the door? We brushed it off, convincing ourselves that maybe it had been there before, and we just hadn't noticed. But something about it gnawed at me. As night fell, that same unsettling feeling returned. The sense that we weren't alone. Later that evening, while sitting on the porch, I saw something, movement in the trees just beyond the edge of the clearing. It was quick, barely more than a flicker, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. I stared into the dark woods, trying to convince myself it was just an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. There was something, or someone out there, watching us. Do you see that? I whispered to Laura, pointing toward the trees. She squinted but shook her head. See what? I didn't answer. The movement had stopped, and the forest was eerily still again. But that night, the scratching came back, louder this time. Closer. I bolted out of bed, grabbed the flashlight, and shined it out the window, but all I saw were the empty woods. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their shadows long and sinister, but nothing was there. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was just beyond the reach of the light, hiding in the darkness. The next morning, Laura was on edge. She hadn't heard the scratching, but she had terrible nightmares, filled with faceless figures and dark shapes creeping through the cabin. I didn't tell her that I had heard it again. As we ate breakfast, I noticed something even more disturbing, footprints in the dirt outside the cabin. They circled the house, leading from the edge of the woods all the way to our front porch, where the scratches had been. These weren't animal tracks. They were human. And they weren't ours. Did you go outside last night? Laura asked, noticing my pale face as I stared at the prints. I shook my head slowly, fear creeping into my voice. No, but someone did. Her face went white. We both knew what this meant. Someone had been outside, watching us, walking around the cabin while we slept. That night, we locked every door and window. But even as we tried to sleep, the sense of dread hung over us like a storm cloud. I lay awake, heart racing, listening to every creak and groan of the old cabin. And then it came again, the scratching. But this time, it wasn't outside. The sound was coming from inside the walls, a slow, deliberate scratching, like nails dragging across wood. I sat up in bed, my breath catching in my throat. Laura stirred beside me, waking up with a start. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I grabbed the flashlight and slowly swung my legs over the side of the bed, shining the light toward the corner of the room where the sound was coming from. The walls bulged slightly, as if something was pressing against them from the inside. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, like whatever was inside was trying to get out. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the scratching. I stood there, frozen, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. Cold, suffocating silence. Until Laura screamed. I whipped around, shining the flashlight on her. She was standing by the window, staring out into the darkness, her face pale with terror. "There's someone out there," she whispered. I rushed to her side and looked out. At first, I saw nothing. But then I saw it, a figure, standing just at the edge of the tree line. Tall, motionless, watching us. I couldn't make out any features, just a dark silhouette against the backdrop of the trees. But I knew it was the same thing that had been watching us the entire time. "We need to leave," I whispered, my voice trembling. But as we turned to grab our things, the lights went out. We were plunged into complete darkness. The flashlight flickered for a moment before going out, leaving us standing in the pitch-black cabin. My heart raced as I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal, no light, nothing. Laura was breathing heavily beside me, her panic palpable. "What do we do?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "We leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." But as we made our way toward the door, the scratching started again, this time all around us. It came from the walls, the ceiling, the floor, as if the entire cabin was alive with the sound. It was deafening, a relentless, maddening noise that echoed in my skull. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The door burst open, and we were met with a gust of icy wind. I grabbed Laura's hand, pulling her outside into the freezing night air. But as we ran toward the car, the figure at the edge of the woods stepped forward. It was closer now. Too close. My heart stopped as I saw it clearly for the first time. Its face, or what was left of it, was a twisted, mutilated mass of flesh and bone, with empty, hollow eye sockets that seemed to stare straight into my soul. Its mouth hung open in a silent scream, and its hands were long, skeletal claws. We bolted for the car, but the figure moved faster than I could have imagined. It was right behind us, its breath cold against the back of my neck. I could hear it, feel it, getting closer and closer. We reached the car, and I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. The scratching sound was back, but now it was coming from the car itself, from inside the walls of the metal, as if the figure had already gotten inside. Finally, the engine roared to life, and we sped away, leaving the cabin and the silent watcher behind. But even as we drove down the dark, winding road, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the next time we were alone. And I knew, deep down, that it would never stop watching. Fourth story. The small town of Black Hollow had a dark history. Every Halloween night, the town fell under a strange, unspoken curse. For generations, the people of Black Hollow had learned to avoid the woods on this night, to lock their doors, and to never venture out after dark. Stories passed down from the elders told of a time when the town was not as peaceful, when witches and dark spirits roamed free, seeking vengeance against the living. It was said that centuries ago, a coven of witches had lived on the outskirts of Black Hollow, practicing dark magic. The townspeople, fearing for their lives, rose up one night and burned them alive. But with their dying breaths, the witches cast a curse that would return every Halloween to claim the souls of those foolish enough to tempt fate. Every year, strange disappearances and deaths would occur, but they were often explained away as accidents or coincidence. But those who lived in Black Hollow long enough knew the truth. And every year, they followed the same ritual: stay inside, stay silent, and pray the curse would pass over them. But this year, something different happened. 16-year-old Danny and his friends didn't believe in curses. They had grown up hearing the stories, but to them, it was all just folklore, tales to scare kids and keep them from having fun on Halloween. So when Danny's best friend, Tommy, proposed a dare to explore the infamous Black Hollow woods on Halloween night, Danny didn't hesitate. "It's all just a bunch of crap," Tommy said confidently, shoving his hands in his pockets. "No one's ever seen anything. It's just stories old people tell." Danny, standing with a flashlight in hand, looked toward the dark, looming trees of the Black Hollow woods. The town seemed eerily quiet this year. Usually, there would be children in costumes, running up and down the streets, trick-or-treating. But tonight, the streets were empty, and most houses had their lights turned off. "I don't know, man," Danny's other friend, Kyle, muttered. "Maybe there's a reason no one goes into those woods." Tommy rolled his eyes. "Come on. Are you seriously scared of some old ghost stories? We'll just go in for an hour. If nothing happens, we win the bet. We'll have bragging rights for the rest of our lives." Danny grinned, trying to mask his nervousness. "I'm in. What's the worst that could happen?" The three boys gathered their flashlights and made their way toward the edge of the woods. The further they walked, the quieter the town became, until all they could hear was the sound of the wind rustling the dry autumn leaves. As they reached the tree line, a strange chill settled in the air. The moon was full, casting an eerie glow over the forest, but the thick canopy of trees blocked out most of the light. Danny shined his flashlight into the woods, its beam barely penetrating the darkness. Tommy led the way, pushing through the thick brush as they ventured deeper into the forest. The boys joked and laughed at first, but soon the oppressive silence of the woods seemed to swallow their voices. Even the wind had died down, leaving only the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Danny felt a growing unease. Something wasn't right. He glanced around, the shadows between the trees seeming to shift and move as if watching them. He told himself it was just his imagination. After all, there was no such thing as witches or curses. Right? After what felt like an eternity of walking, the boys stumbled upon an old, overgrown cemetery. The gravestones were weathered and cracked, covered in moss and ivy. Some were so old that the names were no longer legible. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, making Danny shiver. "Look at this," Tommy said, pointing to a large, ominous gravestone at the far end of the cemetery. It was larger than the others and seemed untouched by time, its surface smooth and black as night. This must be where the witches were buried. Kyle stepped back, glancing nervously at the gravestone. We should go. I don't like this. Oh, come on, Tommy said, laughing. It's just a rock. Nothing's going to happen. As if on cue, a thick fog began to roll in, swirling around their feet. Danny's heart began to race. Something about the air felt different now, heavier, darker. Suddenly, Danny's flashlight flickered and then went out. He tapped it, but it refused to turn back on. He heard Tommy and Kyle curse as their flashlights also flickered and died. We need to leave, Danny said, his voice shaking. But before they could move, a distant, eerie sound filled the air, a low, haunting whisper that seemed to come from all around them. The boys froze, their breath caught in their throats. The whispering grew louder, rising and falling like the wind, but no words could be made out. What the hell is that? Kyle whispered, his eyes wide with terror. I don't know, Tommy said, but his bravado was gone. Let's go. They turned to leave, but the fog had thickened, and the path they had come from was gone. No matter which way they turned, all they saw was an endless sea of trees and gravestones. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. As they frantically searched for a way out, the whispering grew louder, more insistent. Danny's chest tightened as a dark, oppressive force seemed to settle over the cemetery. The air felt suffocating, as if it was alive, pressing in on them from all sides. Then, from the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall, with long, flowing black hair and a tattered dress that seemed to blend into the night. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and hollow, glowing with an unnatural light. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Instead, the whispers filled the air, wrapping around the boys like a shroud. Danny's blood ran cold as he realized who she was. The witch, he whispered, his voice barely audible. The woman's gaze locked onto them, her eyes filled with rage and sorrow. With a slow, deliberate movement, she raised a bony hand and pointed at them. The whispers grew louder, deafening, filling their heads with voices that weren't their own. Tommy screamed and bolted, running blindly into the fog. Kyle followed, his face twisted in fear. But Danny couldn't move. His feet felt like they were rooted to the ground, held in place by some unseen force. The witch's voice, cold and hollow, echoed in his mind. You trespass on sacred ground, she hissed. You will pay for the sins of your forefathers. Danny's heart pounded in his chest as the ground beneath him began to tremble. The gravestone shifted, and from the earth, skeletal hands began to claw their way out, pulling decayed bodies from the graves. The air was thick with the stench of death. Desperate, Danny forced himself to move, running through the fog as fast as his legs would carry him. He could hear Tommy and Kyle's footsteps behind him, but when he looked back, they were gone. Danny stumbled through the woods, his lungs burning, his heart pounding. The fog was everywhere, suffocating, blinding. The whispering never stopped, filling his mind with fear and confusion. He didn't know how long he had been running, but when he finally stopped, he realized he was back in the cemetery. The gravestone stood in front of him, untouched, as if he had never left. No, he gasped, his voice trembling. No, this isn't real. But it was real. The fog parted, and standing before him was the witch, her hollow eyes burning into his soul. Behind her, the dead rose from their graves, their skeletal forms lurching toward him. Danny screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog. He turned to run, but the ground beneath him opened up, and he fell down, down into darkness. The next morning, Black Hollow woke to the news that 3 local boys had gone missing. Search parties combed the woods, but they found nothing. No footprints, no bodies, just the eerie silence of the forest. The townspeople knew what had happened, but no one spoke of it. They had learned long ago to respect the curse, to stay away from the woods on Halloween. But every year, on that same night, the whispers would return, carried on the wind. And if you listened closely, you could hear the voices of the lost, trapped in the cursed woods of Black Hollow, forever haunted by the sins of the past. 5th story. Nestled deep within the dense, ancient forest lay the village of Ettenford, a place where time itself seemed to have come to a standstill. Surrounded by towering trees and thick fog, the village had long been isolated from the outside world, cut off by the treacherous mountain paths that led into it. Few outsiders ever ventured here, and those who did often left with strange stories, if they left at all. Ettenford was known for one peculiar thing, its old shrine. Built long before anyone in the village could remember, it stood on a forgotten hill, hidden among the forest, half consumed by moss and vines. The villagers spoke of it in hushed tones, avoiding it at all costs. No one could recall who had built the shrine or why, but there was one thing everyone knew: you didn't go near it. The villagers believed the shrine held something ancient and malevolent, something that had been sealed away for centuries. For as long as anyone could remember, the village had been cursed with strange disappearances, whispers in the night, and the occasional appearance of strange symbols carved into the trees. People vanished without a trace, and some who returned were never the same, speaking of dark figures and unseen eyes watching them. But for all its strange history, life in Ettenford went on quietly, that is, until the summer of 1997. Jacob had lived in Ettenford his entire life, but unlike the others, he had never been afraid of the forest or the old legends. He was a man of reason, someone who believed in what he could see and touch, not in fairy tales. But there was one thing about Ettenford that had always nagged at him: the old shrine. No one had ever been able to explain why it was there or what purpose it served. And Jacob, growing restless in the quiet village, decided he would be the one to uncover its secrets. "I'm going to find it," he told his friend Marcus one evening as they sat in a dimly lit pub, the only place in the village where people gathered after sundown. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "The shrine? You're joking, right?" "I'm serious. All these stories, none of it makes any sense. I've lived here my whole life, and I've never seen anything strange in the woods. People just get scared because it's dark and quiet. That's all. People disappear out there, Jacob," Marcus said quietly. "There's a reason no one goes near that place. It's not natural." Jacob shook his head. "Superstition. There's something out there, but it's not ghosts or curses. I bet it's just an old burial ground or something. Maybe there's treasure. Who knows?" Marcus leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "My grandfather once told me that no one who enters the shrine ever comes back the same. He said they're changed. You're playing with something you don't understand." Jacob shrugged it off. "I'll be fine. Besides, someone has to put these stories to rest." The next morning, Jacob packed his bag with supplies, a flashlight, some rope, food, and a map of the surrounding woods. The path to the shrine wasn't on any official maps, but the villagers spoke of a forgotten trail, hidden deep within the forest, marked by ancient stones. Most of the villagers refused to talk about it, but Jacob had pieced together enough information over the years to form a rough idea of where to go. The sun was just beginning to rise when Jacob left his house, the morning mist clinging to the ground as he made his way toward the edge of the forest. The trees loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their branches twisting together, blocking out much of the light. Despite his earlier bravado, Jacob felt a gnawing unease as he stepped onto the old trail. The further he walked, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and insects were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made Jacob's skin crawl. He followed the rough path for what felt like hours, the landscape growing more rugged and overgrown. Vines twisted around the trees, and strange symbols, faded and ancient, appeared carved into the bark. As he rounded a bend, Jacob finally saw it, the shrine. It was smaller than he had imagined, more of a stone altar than a building. The stones were worn and cracked, covered in moss and lichen. Strange, intricate carvings adorned its surface, and at its center was a large stone slab, cold and imposing. There was a palpable energy in the air, a feeling that something was watching him. Jacob couldn't shake the sensation that the forest was alive, that the trees themselves were breathing, shifting ever so slightly as if whispering to one another. He approached the shrine cautiously, his flashlight casting long shadows in the dim light. The carvings were more elaborate up close, depicting strange figures and symbols that Jacob couldn't decipher. At the base of the altar was a small, weathered box, half buried in the earth. His heart raced as he bent down to examine it. Without thinking, Jacob reached out and pried the box from the ground. It was heavier than he expected, the wood damp and rotting. His hands trembled as he opened the lid. Inside was a mask. The mask was unlike anything Jacob had ever seen. It was made of a dark, polished stone, with intricate carvings that seemed to shimmer in the low light. Its features were sharp and angular, almost inhuman, with empty eye sockets that seemed to stare back at him. A cold breeze swept through the clearing as he held the mask, sending a shiver down his spine. For a moment, Jacob hesitated. He could feel a presence in the air, something ancient and powerful. But his curiosity overpowered his fear. He lifted the mask, turning it over in his hands, feeling the cold stone against his skin. As soon as he placed the mask against his face, the world around him shifted. The forest became darker, the trees twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like claws. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew heavy with the scent of decay. Jacob's vision blurred as strange, shadowy figures appeared in the corners of his eyes, flitting between the trees, watching him. He ripped the mask off, gasping for breath, but the figures remained. The forest was no longer the same place he had entered. It had transformed into something far more sinister. The shrine, once weathered and old, now stood tall and imposing, its stones glowing with a faint, eerie light. Jacob stumbled backward, heart pounding. The shadows moved closer, their forms becoming more defined, tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes and twisted limbs. They whispered in a language he didn't understand, their voices low and haunting, filling his mind with dread. Panicking, Jacob turned and ran. The forest seemed to close in around him, the path twisting and shifting, leading him deeper into the darkness. No matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, Jacob couldn't tell. The forest was a labyrinth, and every turn brought him back to the same place, the shrine. The shadows grew bolder, closing in, their whispers now deafening. His legs ached, his lungs burned, but he couldn't stop. He collapsed near the altar, the mask still clutched in his hand. The shadows surrounded him, their hollow eyes staring down at him with silent malice. Jacob screamed, but no sound came out. And then everything went still. The shadows stopped, their whispers falling silent as a figure stepped forward from the darkness. It was taller than the others, more solid, and its face was the same as the mask. The figure knelt beside him, its cold, lifeless eyes locking onto Jacob's. "You have awakened me," it whispered, its voice echoing in his mind. "And now you will join me." Jacob felt a cold hand touch his face, and in that moment, he understood the truth. The mask wasn't just a relic, it was a key, a gateway to something far darker. And now, he was bound to it. As the shadows closed in, Jacob's last thought was that he should have listened to the warnings. The villagers of Ettenford never saw Jacob again. Some said he had left the village, others whispered that he had become part of the forest, lost forever. But the truth was far darker. For on quiet nights, if you stood near the edge of the woods, you could still hear the whispers. Years passed, and the story of Jacob became another whispered tale in Ettenford. People spoke of him in the same way they spoke of the shrine, as part of the village's strange and dark history. The few who dared to venture near the forest at night claimed they saw something, shadows shifting unnaturally, figures standing just at the edge of the trees, watching. But no one dared investigate. The fear was too deep-rooted, and the legend of the shrine too ominous. One cold autumn evening, a group of outsiders arrived in Ettenford, tourists who had heard rumors of the strange, forgotten village. They were young, adventurous, and skeptical of the old tales the villagers told them. "There's something off about this place," one of them, a girl named Lily, said as they sat around a fire in the small inn. The others nodded in agreement, though none of them wanted to admit they felt it too. Lily pulled out a worn map she had purchased from a shopkeeper earlier that day. "This shows the location of the shrine," she said, her voice filled with excitement and curiosity. "I say we go and check it out tomorrow. It's probably just an old ruin." The others hesitated, but Lily's adventurous spirit was infectious. By morning, they had made up their minds. The next day, the group followed the path into the forest, just as Jacob had done so many years ago. The woods were thick with mist, and the air felt heavier the deeper they went. They joked to ease their tension, but as the trees became more twisted and the strange symbols began to appear, the mood grew more serious. Finally, they reached the shrine. "It's smaller than I thought," one of them muttered, though there was a palpable tension in the air. The stone altar, ancient and weathered, stood silently before them. The strange carvings on its surface seemed to pulse in the fading daylight. But as they stood there, staring at the shrine, something shifted. The air grew colder, and the forest around them seemed to darken unnaturally. "Do you hear that?" Lily whispered. The group fell silent. At first, there was nothing but the sound of the wind through the trees. But then, faintly, they began to hear whispers, low, indecipherable voices that seemed to come from the shadows themselves. Panic set in. "We should go," one of them said, backing away from the altar. But before they could move, something caught Lily's eye. Half buried in the ground near the shrine was an object, a mask. The same mask Jacob had found all those years ago. "No," one of the villagers who had followed them into the woods cried out. "Don't touch it. Leave it be." Lily hesitated, but her curiosity got the better of her. She reached down and lifted the mask, feeling its cold, polished stone surface. It was heavier than it looked, its empty eye sockets staring back at her. As soon as she touched it, the whispers grew louder. The forest erupted into chaos. The shadows that had once lurked at the edges of the trees now surged forward, taking shape, tall, skeletal figures with hollow eyes, just as Jacob had seen. The air became thick with dread, and the once quiet forest seemed alive with an ancient, malevolent energy. The group screamed, dropping the mask and stumbling backward. But it was too late. The shadows circled them, their twisted forms closing in, their whispers becoming maddening. Lily tried to run, but the path twisted, the forest warping around them, trapping them in a maze of darkness. "We need to get out of here," one of them shouted, but the exit was gone. The forest had changed, just as it had for Jacob. There was no escape. As the group was surrounded, the tall figure from Jacob's vision stepped forward. Its hollow eyes gleamed in the darkness as it approached Lily, who was frozen in place, unable to move. "You have disturbed the shrine," it whispered, its voice echoing in her mind. "Now, you belong to the shadows." No one in the village saw Lily or her friends again. They had simply vanished, just like Jacob before them. The villagers knew what had happened, but said nothing. They had seen it before, and they knew they would see it again. The shrine had claimed more souls, and it would not stop. On certain nights, if you wandered too close to the forest, you could hear their voices, Jacob, Lily, and countless others, trapped in the shadows, their whispers carried on the wind. The mask remained in the shrine, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to find it. And so, the cycle continued. The shrine's secret remained buried in the forest, its darkness growing with each soul it claimed. The village of Ettenford lived on, but the curse was eternal. For as long as the shrine stood, there would always be whispers in the woods, and there would always be those who were drawn to it, unable to resist the call of the shadows.